The boy had 11 minutes of air left in that room, and nobody in the building knew he was there, except a dog nobody was supposed to have noticed at all. Marcus Webb didn't know that yet either, not in those first hours of his shift, pushing a gray mop bucket down the marble corridor of the Halcyon Tower with a squeak in the left wheel he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. The building was 41 stories of glass and steel in the financial district, and at 11 o'clock at night it belonged to nobody but him, the hum of the HVAC system, and the dog curled in the boiler room 2 floors below, waiting for him the way he always waited, ears up before the elevator doors even opened. Marcus was 44 years old, though most people guessed older when they looked at him straight on, at the gray that had come into his beard too early, and the way he favored his right leg on cold nights. He had been a staff sergeant once, an Army combat engineer who'd spent 2 tours clearing roads in Kandahar province that other men were too afraid to walk down, and he had come home from the second tour with 4 inches less femur than he'd left with, and a purple heart he kept in a shoebox because he didn't know what else you were supposed to do with a thing like that. The Department of Veterans Affairs had taken 14 months to approve his disability claim, and by the time the check came, the apartment he'd been renting in Tempe was gone, along with the job at the hardware store that hadn't been able to hold his position through the surgeries. He'd bounced through a transitional housing program, 2 months on a cousin's pull-out couch in Mesa, and finally landed here, 3 years ago now, mopping floors for a facilities contractor that paid $9 over minimum wage and didn't ask questions about the limp or the gaps in his resume. He lived alone in a studio apartment 11 blocks from the tower, a place with a window unit that rattled and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the HVAC system he serviced every night. Dinner was usually something out of a can, eaten standing at the counter, because sitting down for a meal felt like admitting the day was over, and the day being over meant the night was starting, and the night was the part he didn't like. That was when the ringing in his ears got loud in the silence, when the ceiling fan's shadow moved in a way that made something in his chest clench before his mind caught up and told him it was just a fan, just a shadow, just a room in Phoenix and not a compound in Kandahar. He'd started taking the night shift on purpose. Nobody at the cleaning company knew that. They just thought he was a good worker who didn't mind being the only one there. The dog had come into his life on a Tuesday in March, 4 months before any of this happened, and there had been nothing dramatic about it at all. Marcus had gone out back of the tower to the loading dock to smoke, a habit he was supposed to have quit and hadn't, and there was a dog lying against the dumpster enclosure in the rain, not moving toward him, not moving away, just watching him with one eye clouded milky white and the other eye sharp and dark, and entirely too aware. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, or had been built like one once, though the coat had gone patchy in places, thin scar tissue visible along one flank in a pattern too straight and deliberate to be an accident, like something had been done to the animal rather than simply happened to it. Its ribs showed. One ear had a notch bitten clean out of it. "You picked a hell of a spot to die," Marcus had said, because that was the kind of thing he said out loud to nobody in particular these days, and he hadn't meant anything by it, had fully intended to finish his cigarette and go back inside and let the dog be someone else's problem. But the dog hadn't flinched at his voice, hadn't cowered the way a stray usually did around a strange man's boots. It had simply looked at him, steady, patient, the way a soldier looks at another soldier across a room before either of them says a word. Marcus had felt something shift in his own chest that he didn't examine too closely, and he'd gone back inside for a can of tuna from the little kitchenette on the second floor, and that had been that. The dog ate. Marcus watched it eat. Neither of them said it meant anything. "I'm not keeping you," he told the dog the next night, when it was there again, dry now, having apparently found somewhere to shelter from the rain. "This is a job, not a home. You understand that? I got enough going on without a dog." The dog had thumped its tail once against the concrete, exactly once, like it was acknowledging the sentence without agreeing to abide by it, and Marcus had found himself opening another can of tuna anyway. By the end of that first week, he'd moved an old moving blanket into the corner of the boiler room, down in the sub-basement where the building's mechanical systems lived in. A maze of pipes and humming transformers, a space Marcus had access to and nobody else bothered to check after dark. He told himself it was temporary. He told the dog the same thing most nights in the low mutter he used when he thought no one, including, apparently, the dog was paying attention. The dog never seemed to believe him, and it turned out the dog had been right not to. There was a woman on the day cleaning crew, Priya, who caught Marcus wheeling a 50-pound bag of dog food through the loading dock one morning as their shifts overlapped, and who had simply looked at the bag, looked at him, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of mercy in a building where a single wrong word to the wrong supervisor could end a man's income overnight. She started leaving leftover rotisserie chicken from the break room fridge in a plastic bag, with Marcus's name written on it in Sharpie. No note, no explanation, and Marcus never thanked her directly for it because they both understood that thanking her would have turned an unspoken kindness into a conversation neither of them wanted to have where it could be overheard. It was the kind of quiet complicity that kept a secret alive in a workplace, not silence out of indifference, but silence as a form of protection. The sort veterans and the people who understand them without needing it explained tend to extend to one another instinctively. Marcus noticed it, filed it away, and made sure to leave the break room microwave spotless on the nights he used it, a wordless thank you in return. He didn't have a name for it at first. He just called it dog, flat, unadorned, a word that kept things at a safe distance. It was the dog's habits that gave it a name eventually, the way it did this thing, this specific thing, where it would go still all over, every muscle locking, and then let out 2 short huffs of breath through its nose, sharp and deliberate, whenever it wanted Marcus to notice something. The first time it happened was over a gas can Marcus had left too close to the boiler, forgotten from a maintenance job earlier that week. The dog had frozen at the doorway, refused to come further into the room, and huffed twice, staring at the can like it was something with teeth. Marcus had almost ignored it. Almost. But there was something about the specificity of the gesture, the controlled, trained quality of it, that made the hair go up on the back of his neck, the way it used to when a translator's voice changed pitch on a bad stretch of road. He'd moved the can. He'd stood there a long moment afterward, looking at the dog, recalculating something. "You're not just a stray, are you?" he'd said. It wasn't a question so much as a statement working its way toward becoming a fact. The dog had lain back down on the blanket, apparently satisfied that its job was done, and Marcus had started calling him Ranger that same week, for no reason he could fully explain except that the name felt like it belonged to something that had once had a rank. It was the tattoo that confirmed it. Marcus found it by accident, running a hand along the inside of the dog's left ear one evening while checking an infected scrape near the base of it. And there, faded but legible under the thin fur, was a series of numbers and letters inked into the pink skin, a military working dog identification tattoo, the kind the Department of Defense used to mark its 4-legged soldiers before microchips became standard. Marcus had gone very still himself then, in a mirror of the dog's own stillness, staring at the tattoo like it might rearrange itself into something less impossible. He knew a guy, everybody who'd served knew a guy, somebody still plugged into the network of old unit contacts and VFW email chains and Facebook groups full of men who understood each other in ways nobody back home ever quite managed to. Marcus's guy was Danny Ochoa, who'd been a kennel master at Bagram back when Marcus was still walking roads with a mine detector, and who now ran a small K-9 training operation outside Tucson, working mostly with police departments looking to build out their K-9 units. Marcus called him on a Thursday afternoon before his shift, sitting on the edge of his bed with the phone against his ear and Ranger's tag number written on a torn piece of receipt paper in his other hand. "Say that number again," Danny said, and there was a pause on the line, the sound of a keyboard, a database being searched somewhere in a system Marcus didn't have access to anymore. You got him where? Behind a dumpster. Dumpster enclosure, actually, if we're being precise. Marcus, you know what this number is. My God, a guess. This is Kilo Service Designation K914. Malinois, imported out of the Netherlands, trained at Lackland, deployed twice, Helmand in 15, then Kandahar in 17 with the 3rd MWD Detachment, specialized in explosive ordnance detection. He's got 2 confirmed finds that kept convoy routes clear, one of them credited with saving an entire route clearance platoon outside Fob Passab. Danny's voice had changed by the time he got to the end of that sentence, gone quieter, more careful, the way voices did when men who'd been overseas talked about the things that had happened there. His handler was a corporal named Whitfield. IED took them both out on a patrol in 2018. Whitfield didn't make it, and the dog got shrapnel along his flank and lost most of the vision in one eye. Records say he was pulled from active service, sent through a rehab program, and then nothing. Paperwork just stops. Happens sometimes when a dog gets adopted out through a private handler instead of the official program, or when a contractor loses track of the chain, where you say you found him. Dumpster, Phoenix, behind an office tower. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Marcus checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Well, Danny said finally, I guess he found his way home to somebody then. Way these things sometimes go, they find the guy who understands. Marcus hadn't said much after that. He'd sat on the edge of his bed a long time after hanging up, looking at Ranger, at Kilo, at K914, at a hero with a scarred flank and a clouded eye who had once walked point in front of men who trusted him with their lives, and who was now sleeping on a moving blanket in a boiler room because nobody had bothered to keep track of him once the war stopped needing him. Marcus understood that particular kind of forgetting better than most people alive. He put a hand on the dog's head, and the dog didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just leaned into it the way he'd learned to do with Marcus over these slow accumulating weeks, and Marcus said, out loud to the empty apartment, Yeah, I know how that goes, buddy. I know exactly how that goes. The problem, of course, was Halcyon Tower's policy, which had been posted in bold red letters on the lobby doors since the previous autumn. No pets or animals permitted on premises at any time, PER building ownership. The policy had gone up after a lawsuit. A tenant on the 22nd floor had brought in an emotional support dog that bit a delivery driver, and Richard Reeves, the CEO of Reeves Dynamics, which owned the building along with roughly a third of the office towers in that stretch of downtown, had decided the simplest fix was a blanket ban rather than a case-by-case review. Reeves was 52, silver-haired in the deliberate, styled way of a man who paid someone to make sure of it, and he ran his company the way he apparently ran everything else in his life, efficiently, with minimal tolerance for variables he hadn't personally approved. Marcus had seen him maybe 4 times in 3 years, always from a distance, always trailed by an assistant carrying a tablet, never once making eye contact with the man mopping the floor he was walking across. Keeping Ranger in the building was, strictly speaking, a fireable offense, and Marcus knew it every single night he came in the loading dock entrance with a duffel bag of dog food hidden under a stack of folded rags. He told himself it was temporary while he looked for another arrangement. He told himself that for 4 months, through spring and into the start of a brutal Phoenix summer, and somewhere in there, the temporary stopped feeling temporary at all, and started feeling like the only thing keeping either of them upright. The bonding, when Marcus thought about it later, hadn't happened in any single moment. It had happened in the accumulation of small ones, the way trust always does between 2 creatures who have learned the hard way not to trust easily. It happened in the 4 a.m. lulls of his shift, when Marcus would sit on an overturned bucket in the boiler room and eat a sandwich, and Ranger would rest his head on Marcus's boot, not asking for anything, just present, just there, the weight of him a kind of ballast against whatever had been circling in Marcus's head that particular night. It happened the evening Ranger's bad hip locked up on the stairs, and Marcus had to half carry him down 2 flights, feeling the dog's whole body trembling with the effort of not resisting, of trusting a stranger's arms around a body that had learned arms often meant pain. It happened the night of the July monsoon, when thunder cracked directly over the tower and Ranger came apart at the seams, panting hard, drooling, pressed so tight into the corner of the boiler room that his claws scraped against the concrete trying to dig somewhere that didn't exist. Marcus had recognized that particular unraveling immediately, because he'd lived inside a version of it himself more nights than he could count. He hadn't reached for the dog right away. He'd learned that much, at least, from his own therapist, a soft-spoken woman at the VA clinic who'd taught him that panic wasn't always fixed by being touched. Sometimes it needed space. Indeed, a steady voice and time. So he'd sat on the floor 3 feet away, not looking directly at the dog, and talked in a low, even tone about nothing in particular, about a road outside Kandahar, about the smell of diesel and dust, about the specific blue of the sky there in the mornings before the heat came up, until slowly, in his own time, Ranger had crept the 3 feet across the concrete and put his head in Marcus's lap and let out a long, shuddering breath that Marcus felt more than heard. "There you go," Marcus had murmured, one hand resting on the dog's ruined ear. "There you go. I got you. Ain't nobody coming through that door tonight but me." He cleaned the old wound on Ranger's flank every few days with saline and antibiotic ointment stolen in small quantities from the first aid kit in the janitorial closet, and Ranger held still for it every time with a stoicism that told Marcus the dog had been handled by medics before, had learned somewhere along the way that pain sometimes came before healing, and you simply endured the space between. Marcus talked through the whole process, narrating it the way he imagined a handler once might have, a habit he fell into without meaning to. "Almost done. You're doing good. Corporal Whitfield would be proud of you, you know that. Whoever he was. I never met the man, but anybody who trained a dog this steady, this smart, he knew what he was doing." Ranger's tail would thump once against the concrete at the mention of a name he could not possibly have understood, and Marcus told himself that was coincidence and didn't quite believe it. There was dry humor in it, too, the kind that crept in almost without permission the way it always did between 2 beings sharing close quarters. Ranger had developed an opinion about the particular brand of industrial floor cleaner Marcus used on level 14, and would plant himself stubbornly at the far end of the hallway whenever Marcus wheeled the mop bucket toward it, refusing to come closer until the smell dissipated. "You're a decorated combat veteran, and you've got a thing about lemon-scented pine sol," Marcus told him one night, laughing for what felt like the first time in longer than he wanted to admit. "Man, the things that get to us." Ranger had looked at him with what Marcus swore was genuine disdain, and then trotted a wide arc around the wet floor sign like it had personally wronged him, and Marcus had laughed again, quieter this time, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight for the better part of 6 years. The routine settled into something Marcus could set a clock by, and there was comfort in that, a kind of comfort he hadn't let himself have in a long time. He clocked in at 6. Ranger met him at the loading dock door, sitting rather than jumping, disciplined even in his greeting, though his tail would beat a fast rhythm against the concrete that gave away how much the sitting cost him. They ate together in the boiler room before Marcus started his floors, not out of the same bowl. Marcus wasn't sentimental to the point of foolishness, but at the same time, Marcus with his sandwich on the overturned bucket and Ranger with his kibble in a repurposed steel mixing bowl, Marcus had liberated from the building's unused catering kitchen. Then the floors, level by level, Ranger trailing at whatever distance suited him, sometimes right at Marcus's heel, sometimes off exploring a stairwell landing with the unhurried curiosity of a dog who had, for the first time in longer than his body could probably remember. Nothing urgent to search for. Around 1 in the morning, they took what Marcus privately called their patrol break, 15 minutes on the loading dock with the door cracked to the warm desert night, Marcus smoking his one permitted cigarette of the shift, while Ranger sat beside him watching the empty street, both of them quiet in the specific companionable way of creatures who had run out of any need to fill silence with noise. It was on one of those loading dock breaks, maybe 6 weeks in, that Marcus told the dog things he hadn't said out loud to another living creature since his last mandated session at the VA clinic, and even then only in the edited clinical version his therapist got. He told Ranger about the truck. About the specific ordinary Tuesday morning outside Kandahar, when a route he'd swept clean himself 2 days earlier turned out not to be clean at all. About the sound that still came to him some nights not as a memory exactly, but as a physical sensation low in his sternum, a pressure before a noise. He told him about Corporal Reyes, 22 years old, from a town in West Texas Marcus had promised to visit and never had, because visiting felt like it would make the promise feel finished, and finished felt like something Marcus wasn't ready to let it be. He told him about the 14 months waiting on a disability claim while a caseworker with a rotating cast of Mies kept telling him his file was in review, about watching his savings account empty out one modest, humiliating withdrawal at a time, about the specific shame of asking his cousin if he could sleep on a couch for a while and hearing the hesitation before she said yes. Ranger didn't do anything dramatic while Marcus talked. He simply leaned his weight, slow and deliberate, against Marcus's leg, the exact pressure of a body saying, "I am here and you are not carrying this alone tonight," and Marcus found that the specific gravity of a dog's weight against his leg did something no therapist's carefully worded validation ever quite managed. It didn't fix anything, but it made the carrying possible. The mirroring went both directions, and Marcus wasn't slow to notice it. Ranger flinched hard at sudden overhead noise. The particular clatter of a dropped ceiling tile once sent him bolting for the stairwell so fast Marcus didn't catch up to him for a full 2 minutes, finding him finally pressed flat under a utility sink with his one good eye wide and his breath coming in short controlled pants that looked, to Marcus's practiced eye, exactly like what his own hyperarousal looked like from the outside, the thing his therapist called a startle response. The nervous system's refusal to believe the war was actually over just because the calendar said so. Marcus had crouched down that day, not reaching, just present, and said the same low things he imagined, somewhere in the back of his mind. Another handler might have once said to this same dog on a road that mattered far more than a Tuesday hallway in Phoenix. You're okay, nothing's coming through that door. I got eyes on everything, you don't have to. It took 11 minutes for Ranger to come out from under the sink that day, and Marcus counted every one of them, and neither of them ever spoke of it again, though Marcus started announcing himself a half-second earlier before any door swung open after that. A small unconscious accommodation that cost him nothing and meant, he suspected, quite a lot. He cleaned the flank wound and the notched ear every few days, saline first, then a careful dab of antibiotic ointment worked in with 2 fingers while Ranger lay still on the moving blanket, with the particular resigned patience of a soldier who had been through worse hands than this. Marcus talked through it every time, an unbroken habit by then, narrating the mundane the way he once narrated a slow walk down a suspect road, because he had learned somewhere along the way, maybe from Reyes, maybe from his own mother, maybe simply from being a person who had needed it done for him more than once, that steady words mattered more than their content. Almost done, big guy. You did good today. Priya left chicken again. Don't tell the day crew I know where it comes from. Ranger's ear would twitch at the sound of Marcus's voice dropping into that particular register, and some nights, when the wound was healing well and the ointment barely stung, his tail would thump twice against the blanket, unhurried content, a soldier accepting a compliment he'd otherwise have shrugged off. Not every night was gentle. There was a stretch in August when a heat wave pushed the city past 115 degrees for 6 straight days, and the aging air handler on the building's east wing started cycling erratically, dropping the boiler room's temperature control offline for hours at a stretch. Ranger, whose coat still hadn't fully recovered from whatever deprivation had thinned it before Marcus found him, struggled visibly in the heat, panting hard, refusing food, lying flat against the coolest patch of concrete he could find. Marcus spent 2 of those nights running a damp towel over the dog's belly and paws every 20 minutes, ferrying ice from the breakroom machine in a plastic bag wrapped in a dish towel, sitting up through what would have otherwise been his break, entirely focused on keeping one overheating animal alive in a windowless room 40 feet underground. He didn't sleep those 2 days at home afterward either, too wound up with worry to manage it, and when he came back in on the 3rd night and found Ranger standing at the loading dock door to greet him, tail up, breathing easy again, Marcus had to turn away for a moment and press the heel of his hand hard against his eyes before he trusted his voice enough to say hello. "You scared the hell out of me," he told the dog once he got himself steady. "Don't do that again, I mean it." Ranger, for his part, simply leaned his full weight against Marcus's legs and stayed there a long while, and Marcus understood, without either of them needing to say anything further, that some apology had passed between them and some forgiveness too. It was late September, a Thursday, when everything changed, and it started the way most disasters do, with something ordinary going slightly, invisibly wrong hours before. Anyone noticed? Reeves Dynamics was hosting a donor gala that night on the 38th floor, some fundraising event for a children's hospital initiative that Richard Reeves's public relations team had organized with the kind of glossy precision that made Marcus's job considerably harder, since it meant an extra 4 hours of setup and breakdown work layered onto his usual shift. Marcus had clocked in at his normal time, 6 p.m., and had been told by his supervisor, a tired man named Osai who ran facilities for 3 buildings and never seemed to sleep, that Marcus would need to handle the sub-basement mechanical rooms that night in addition to his usual floors, since the maintenance contractor who normally serviced them had gone on medical leave the week before and nobody had been assigned to cover it. "Should be nothing to it," Osa had said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes, the way people did when they were handing off a task they knew was more than it appeared to be. "Just walk it, check the gauges, make sure nothing looks off before the party crowd shows up. Buildings and ground says it's routine." Marcus had walked the sub-basement 100 times before. He knew the layout the way he knew his own apartment, the transformer room, the water treatment room, the boiler room where Ranger slept, and past that, a mechanical room that housed the natural gas lines feeding the building's kitchen facilities and backup generators, a room that was supposed to be inspected quarterly by a licensed technician, and Marcus would later learn had not actually been inspected in 14 months. Because the inspection line item had been quietly cut from that year's facilities budget, by a cost reduction initiative championed by Reeves Dynamics' chief operating officer, a man named Aldous Prout, who had needed to shave 4% off operational spending to hit a bonus threshold tied to the company's quarterly earnings call, and who had signed off on a stack of falsified inspection certificates rather than let anyone upstairs know the corners that were actually being cut. Marcus didn't know any of that yet. What he knew at 9:40 that evening, walking his rounds with Ranger padding a few feet behind him, the dog had taken to shadowing him on the lower floors after hours, when the risk of encountering anyone from the tenant companies was close to zero, was that Ranger stopped dead in the corridor outside the gas mechanical room, went rigid in that specific full body way Marcus had come to know meant something, and let out 2 sharp huffs through his nose, staring hard at the door. Marcus stopped walking. "What is it, boy?" Ranger huffed again, twice, and this time backed up half a step, ears pinned, a posture Marcus hadn't seen from him before, not fear exactly, but something closer to alarm, the specific controlled alarm of a professional recognizing a professional problem. Marcus crouched down to the dog's level, out of instinct more than training, and became aware in the stillness of a smell he'd almost missed under the ambient hum of the building. Faint, sweetish, chemical, the mercaptan additive they put in natural gas specifically so a leak wouldn't go unnoticed by the human nose. It was faint. It was very faint. But it was there, and Ranger, trained for years to detect trace concentrations of chemical compounds that no human nose could register at all, had caught it from 6 feet outside a closed door. Marcus's training kicked in before his conscious mind had even finished processing the smell, the old muscle memory from years of clearing roads, the specific calm that settled over him whenever the stakes went from ordinary to potentially lethal, a calm that felt almost like relief, like slipping into a version of himself that had been waiting, unused, for a long time. He didn't open the door. You didn't open a door on a suspected gas leak without ventilating first, without checking the space around it, without ruling out an ignition source in the vicinity. He put a hand flat against the door itself, cool, no unusual vibration, no sound of hissing loud enough to hear through the metal, and then he backed Ranger away 10 feet, 15, into the transformer room doorway and pulled out his phone. He was dialing the after-hours facility's emergency line, the same call he'd made a dozen times before for burst pipes and tripped breakers, when he heard it, faint, muffled, coming from somewhere past the mechanical room, past where the corridor bent toward the old freight elevator shaft that served the sub-basement levels but hadn't been used in years, not since the building's last major renovation had installed a newer service elevator on the opposite side of the structure. A voice, small. A child's voice, thin and frightened, calling out words Marcus couldn't quite make out yet, muffled by concrete and distance and the low, continuous hum of machinery. Marcus's blood went cold in a way it hadn't in years, not since a road outside Kandahar, and every instinct he had, every hard-won instinct from 2 deployments, and a lifetime of training himself to move toward danger instead of away from it, snapped into focus at once. He found the boy 9 minutes later. After tracing the sound down a service corridor Marcus hadn't walked in months, through a door that should have been locked and wasn't, into a disused mechanical alcove adjacent to the old freight elevator shaft, a space that Marcus would learn afterward, connected via an old maintenance crawlspace to a ventilation duct running directly past the gas mechanical room, close enough that the leak, growing steadily worse over the preceding hours, had begun seeping trace amounts of gas into the enclosed alcove itself. The boy was maybe 9 years old, dressed in a small blazer and dress shoes clearly meant for the gala upstairs, curled against the base of an old electrical panel, crying in the particular exhausted, hiccuping way of a child who has been crying for a long time and has mostly run out of the energy for it. "Hey," Marcus said, dropping to his knees in the doorway, keeping his voice low and even the same voice he used to talk Ranger down from a panic. "Hey, buddy, I got you. My name's Marcus. I work here. You're okay." The boy's name was Theo. Marcus got that much out of him in the first 30 seconds, along with the shape of what had happened. He'd slipped away from the gala upstairs during a boring speech, wandered into a service elevator out of 9-year-old curiosity, and gotten it stuck between floors when he pressed too many buttons at once in a rising panic, prying the doors open himself with the kind of reckless nerve only a child possesses. Only to find himself not on a floor at all, but in this half-finished mechanical gap between them, with no way back up the shaft and a door at the bottom that had swollen shut and wouldn't budge. He'd been down there for nearly 2 hours. Marcus did the math in his head, fast and grim. 2 hours, in a poorly ventilated space that was slowly filling with trace gas from a leak nobody upstairs even knew existed yet. "Theo, I need you to breathe slow for me, okay? Real slow. Can you do that?" Marcus kept his voice gentle even as his mind ran calculations at a speed that felt almost violent in its clarity. Concentration levels, time, distance to the nearest source of fresh air, the layout of the crawlspace connecting this alcove to the ventilation system, the fact that somewhere close by, an electrical panel not unlike the one Theo was leaning against could, if it arced even slightly, provide exactly the kind of ignition source that turned a slow leak into something the whole sub-basement wouldn't survive. He thought about the gala 8 floors above them, 200 donors, string quartet, waiters with trays of champagne. None of them had any idea what was happening 4 floors beneath their shoes. Ranger had followed him the whole way, silent, controlled, moving with the low economical gait Marcus now recognized as a working posture rather than an ordinary walk, and the dog pressed himself into the doorway of the alcove and went rigid again, staring past Marcus and Theo toward the crawlspace opening in the far wall, the 2 sharp huffs coming again, more urgent this time, a warning Marcus didn't need translated twice. "Okay," Marcus said, mostly to himself, mostly to steady his own hands, which he realized distantly were shaking slightly, an old and familiar tremor he hadn't felt in this particular way since the last time he'd knelt over a suspected device on a dirt road with other men's lives depending on his hands staying steady. "Okay, we're gonna get you out of here, Theo. I promise you that. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say, all right? Exactly." He called it in as he worked, not the general facilities line this time, but 911, his voice clipped and precise in a way that surprised even him, giving coordinates and hazard details with the calm specificity of a man reporting a threat assessment rather than a panicked civilian. Suspected gas leak, sub-basement level 2, child trapped in adjacent mechanical alcove, possible ignition source nearby. Evacuate the 38th floor gala immediately as a precaution. Fire department and gas utility emergency response needed now. The dispatcher's voice on the other end went sharp with attention the moment he finished the sentence. Before he moved another step, Marcus made himself do the thing his old team sergeant had drilled into him, until it was reflex rather than choice. Stop, breathe, assess, before you act on an unstable site. He ran through it the way he'd been trained to, fast but complete, no step skipped just because a child's crying made every second feel like an emergency that couldn't afford method. Ignition sources first. He scanned the alcove for anything live, any panel with exposed contacts, any outlet that looked compromised, and found the electrical panel Theo was leaning against, old, its cover slightly ajar, a real and present risk if anything jostled it wrong. Ventilation second. He checked the crawlspace opening Ranger kept alerting toward, judged the airflow direction by the faint stir of dust in his flashlight beam, and confirmed the gas was drifting toward them rather than away, which meant time was working against him rather than for him. Egress third. He traced the fastest clean route back out, ruling out the elevator shaft entirely, settling on the service corridor he'd come in through as the only viable path. Only once all 3 were fixed in his mind did he let himself move again, and he moved differently after that, no longer improvising but executing, each action deliberate, economical, the exact opposite of panic. Getting Theo out of the alcove and clear of the crawlspace vent took another 6 minutes that felt, to Marcus, like the longest 6 minutes of his adult life, longer even than certain minutes he'd spent on roads he didn't like to think about. The swollen door at the alcove's far end wouldn't give to a shoulder, so Marcus worked it instead the way he'd worked 100 stuck panels and jammed hatches in his old life. Methodical, patient, using a flathead screwdriver from his utility belt to walk the hinge pins loose rather than forcing it, and risking a spark against old metal in an atmosphere he no longer trusted. Theo cried through most of it, quietly now, more from exhaustion than terror, and Marcus kept talking the entire time, not the calm-down voice this time, but a running, deliberately mundane narration, the same trick he used on Ranger during storms, describing exactly what his hands were doing, keeping the boy's mind tethered to the present instead of the danger. Ranger stayed in the doorway the whole time, a sentinel, occasionally letting out a low huff whenever Marcus's screwdriver got near a particular corner of the panel, a warning Marcus heeded without question, adjusting his angle each time. The door came free on the fourth try. Marcus scooped Theo up. He weighed less than Marcus expected, all elbows and knees and the particular fragile lightness of a scared child, and carried him back through the service corridor at a fast, controlled pace, Ranger moving ahead of them now, leading rather than following, choosing the path with the confidence of a dog who had done exactly this kind of work before, clearing a route for people who couldn't clear it themselves. They came out into the transformer room stairwell just as the first responding fire crew was making entry through the loading dock, and Marcus felt his knees go momentarily weak with an adrenaline crash, so sudden it nearly took him down, handing Theo off to a paramedic who immediately wrapped him in a silver emergency blanket and started running through a rapid series of questions about dizziness and headache and how long he'd been down there. It was another 40 minutes before Richard Reeves made it down to the sub-basement level himself, having been pulled bodily out of his own gala by a security director, white-faced with the news that his son had been found in a gas-contaminated mechanical space by a night janitor and a stray dog. Marcus was still sitting on the loading dock steps when Reeves arrived, Ranger's head resting heavy across his lap, both of them wrapped in the flat exhaustion that comes after a body has run entirely on adrenaline and then stopped. Reeves came off the elevator at a dead run despite the tailored tuxedo, and Marcus watched something in the man's face crack open completely the moment he saw his son sitting upright on the back of an ambulance, alert, scared but breathing clean air, alive. Reeves didn't say anything to Marcus at first. He went straight to Theo, dropped to his knees on the concrete without any apparent concern for the $2,000 suit, and held his son so tight and so long that the paramedic had to gently remind him the boy needed to finish his oxygen assessment. It was only afterward, when Theo had been settled into the ambulance for transport to the hospital as a precaution, that Reeves turned around and looked, really looked, for the first time in 3 years of walking past him in hallways, at the man sitting on the steps with a scarred dog's head in his lap. "You're the one who found him," Reeves said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir." "How?" Marcus considered how much to say, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't have the energy left to soften it. "Your gas mechanical room's got a leak nobody's caught in 14 months, because nobody inspected it in 14 months, because somebody upstairs cut the inspection line item out of the budget and covered it with paperwork saying otherwise. Your son wandered into an old service elevator and got stuck in a maintenance gap that happens to share ventilation with that same mechanical room. If my dog hadn't smelled the leak from the corridor 2 hours before it got bad enough for a human nose to catch it, and if I hadn't gone looking for where that smell was coming from and heard your boy crying while I was standing there, this ends a lot worse tonight than a scare and a hospital visit for observation. That's how." Reeves's face went through several things in quick succession: shock, disbelief, something that looked almost like anger before Marcus realized it wasn't directed at him at all. "Your dog." "Yes, sir." "There's a no pets policy in this building. I signed that policy myself." Marcus felt something old and tired rise up in his chest, not quite anger, more like the flat weariness of a man who'd spent years being told the rules that governed his life by people who'd never once had to live inside the consequences of them. "I know it, sir. I've been breaking it for 4 months. This dog's name is Kilo, service number K914. He did 2 deployments as a military working dog, found live IEDs on convoy routes in Afghanistan, got wounded in an attack that killed his handler, and then got lost in some paperwork gap after his rehab program, and ended up starving behind a dumpster outside your building. He's the reason your son is sitting in that ambulance right now instead of somewhere a lot worse. So you can fire me for the policy violation if that's where your head's at tonight. I'd understand it. But I want it on record that I'd do it again, every single night, and so would he. There was a long silence on the loading dock, filled only by the idling of the fire engine and the distant murmur of gala guests being escorted out a side entrance by security, confused and half-dressed for a party that had ended without an explanation any of them yet understood. Reeves looked down at Ranger, who lifted his head from Marcus's lap and looked back at the CEO with the same steady, unhurried assessment he'd once given Marcus that first rainy night by the dumpster, as though evaluating whether this particular human was worth the trouble of trusting. He found the leak, Reeves said slowly, working through it out loud, before it was strong enough for a person to smell. Yes, sir. And the inspection records, you're telling me they're falsified. I'm telling you what I know from working in that sub-basement 3 years running, sir, and what my supervisor let slip when he handed me the room tonight instead of the contractor who's supposed to service it. I don't have your books, but I'd bet my pension, if I still had one, that somebody's going to find a real gap between what got signed off and what actually got done down there. Reeves stood there a long moment, looking at Marcus, looking at the dog, looking somewhere past both of them toward the ambulance where his son sat wrapped in a silver blanket, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, the posture of a man recalculating an entire framework of assumptions in real time. What's your name? Marcus Webb. Staff Sergeant, Reeves said, and Marcus's eyebrows went up slightly because he hadn't offered that. Reeves noticed the reaction and gestured, faintly embarrassed, at Marcus's forearm, where the edge of an old unit tattoo showed below his rolled sleeve. I served 4 years myself. Navy, Supply Corps, nothing like what you did, but I know the ink when I see it. He paused. I'm going to need you to walk me through everything. Tonight, tomorrow, however long it takes. In Mr. Webb's, that dog isn't going anywhere. Not out of this building, and not out of a job if he wants one. I don't care what policy I signed. I'm rewriting it tonight. The investigation that followed moved faster than Marcus expected, propelled by a father's fury rather than ordinary corporate process. Reeves Dynamics brought in an independent structural and safety auditor within 48 hours, and the findings, once they came back, were worse than even Marcus had guessed. The gas mechanical room's inspection log going back over a year had been entirely fabricated. Dates, technician signatures, pressure readings, all of it invented wholesale by a facilities vendor working under direct instruction from Aldous Prout, the chief operating officer, who had needed the savings to hit a bonus metric and had gambled, cynically and correctly for far too long, that nothing would go wrong in the meantime. The leak itself had started small, a corroded valve joint that a real inspection would have caught and replaced for a few $100s, and had grown slowly worse over months of neglect until it very nearly killed a 9-year-old boy in a building his own father owned. Marcus was pulled into 2 of the early interviews almost by accident, because the auditors kept circling back to him as the one person who'd actually been inside that mechanical room in recent memory, and it was in the second of those sessions, going through the building's old work order history with a woman from T. He auditing firm named Delacroix, that he noticed something that made the whole shape of it click into place. He remembered, from 3 years of pushing a mop past that same door, a maintenance technician named Ferris who used to service the gas room quarterly without fail, a heavy-set older man who liked to talk about his grandkids while he worked, and who Marcus hadn't seen in the building in well over a year. When Marcus mentioned the name, almost as an aside, Delacroix went very still and pulled up a vendor contract that showed Ferris's employer had been quietly dropped from Reeves' Dynamic Service roster 14 months earlier, replaced by a smaller, cheaper contractor that on paper had performed 4 separate quarterly inspections since, each one signed off by a technician whose license number, when Delacroix cross-referenced it against the state licensing board, turned out to belong to a man who had retired from the trade 6 years prior and was, at the time of the supposed inspections, recuperating from hip surgery in an assisted living facility 2 states away. Someone built this to survive a glance, Delacroix said, more to herself than to Marcus, spreading the falsified certificates across the conference table like a hand of cards that didn't add up. Not a real audit, just enough to survive somebody flipping through a binder once a year. She looked up at him. You caught what an entire compliance department missed for over a year, Mr. Webb, you and that dog. The paper trail, once the auditors knew where to pull, unraveled fast. Pruitt's assistant, facing her own potential liability, once investigators made clear the falsification carried criminal exposure, and not just a corporate embarrassment, produced an email chain going back 18 months in which Pruitt had explicitly instructed the facility's director to find efficiencies in the mechanical inspection budget ahead of the fiscal year's final quarter, followed 3 weeks later by a second email, shorter, more pointed, noting that the inspection line item alone represented an easy 4 points toward target if it were simply removed rather than renegotiated. Nowhere in the chain did Pruitt use the word skip or falsify. He hadn't needed to. Everyone below him in that chain had understood exactly what was being asked, the way people in organizations often do when the instruction arrives dressed in the bloodless language of efficiency instead of its plainer, uglier name. Marcus gave his account to the auditors with the same flat, methodical precision he'd used calling in the emergency that night, laying out the timeline, the smell, Ranger's alert, the sequence of decisions that had led him down that corridor at exactly the right moment. He was careful, in every interview, to give the dog full credit rather than folding it quietly into his own account the way a humbler telling might have done. I didn't find that leak, he told the auditors, told the fire marshal, told the local news reporter who eventually caught wind of the story and showed up at the building with a camera crew. My dog found it. I just knew enough from my own service to trust him when he told me something was wrong. Aldous Pruitt was terminated within the week, and Reeves Dynamics turned the falsified inspection records over to the city's Building Safety Division, which opened its own formal review. Not the kind of quiet, image-protecting settlement a company like Reeves Dynamics might once have preferred, but a real one with real findings entered into a public record, because Richard Reeves, changed by watching his son carried out of a mechanical alcove alive when it could so easily have gone otherwise, had decided he no longer had any patience for the kind of corner cutting that had nearly cost him everything. Marcus was called into Reeves's office on the 14th floor 2 weeks after that night, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the mountains that Marcus had cleaned 100 times without ever once being invited to sit in the chair facing the desk. Ranger came too. Reeves had insisted on that, in fact, had specifically asked that the dog be present, and Marcus found the request oddly touching in a way he didn't examine too closely. I want to offer you something, Reeves said, once they were both seated, Theo's baseball glove sitting incongruously on the corner of the CEO's otherwise pristine desk, evidence of a father who'd apparently started bringing his son by the office more often since that night. A settlement, a real one. Compensation for what happened, for what your dog did, for the fact that a piece of gross negligence in my own company nearly killed my son, and it took a janitor and a stray dog to catch what an entire facilities department was supposed to catch first. My lawyers have a number in mind. It's a large number, Mr. Webb. Marcus sat with that for a moment, turning it over, aware of Ranger's weight settled against his. Boot beneath the desk, steady and warm. I appreciate that, sir, I do, but I didn't do what I did for money, and neither did he. He nodded down toward the dog. What I'd actually want, if you're asking, I want Kilo recognized properly, not as a stray somebody's tolerating on the premises. as a working dog, retired with the honors that go with that, and a home here that's actually his, not something we're both hiding every night hoping nobody upstairs notices. And I want the no pets policy rewritten the right way, not torn up entirely. I understand why you needed rules after that lawsuit, but written so a service animal, a working dog, a dog like him, has a real place instead of getting treated like a liability the second somebody decides he's inconvenient. That's what I want. That and my job. I like my job, sir. Most nights, anyway. Reeves studied him a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked almost like respect, the specific quality of respect that comes only from watching a man turn down more money than he's ever had in exchange for something he actually cares about instead. You could take the settlement and still get all of that, you know. They're not mutually exclusive. No, sir, I suppose they're not, but I've spent enough years having things handed to me with strings I didn't ask for attached. I'd rather earn the parts that matter and skip the rest. They settled it in the end, somewhere in the middle, a modest settlement Marcus eventually accepted only after Reeves pointed out, not unreasonably, that it would let him move out of the studio apartment with the rattling window unit and into something that didn't require him to eat dinner standing at a counter every night, and Marcus found he didn't have quite enough principle left in him to argue with that particular logic. But the settlement was never the thing that mattered to him, not really, not in the way the rest of it did. What mattered was the small brass plaque that went up outside the sub-basement boiler room 3 weeks later, easy to miss unless you knew to look for it, reading simply, "In service of this building, K914 Kilo, U.S. Army," and beneath that smaller, resident K9 Halcyon Tower. What mattered was the revised building policy, posted now beside the old red-lettered sign, carving out a permanent, dignified exception for working and service animals. An exception written specifically, if you read closely enough, to include dogs who had served and been forgotten and found their way, against every odd, back into a life that needed them. What mattered most of all, though, was smaller than any of that, and Marcus thought about it most nights afterward, sitting on the overturned bucket in a boiler room that was legally his now to occupy, eating a sandwich in the 4 a.m. lull with Ranger's head resting heavy across his boot exactly the way it always had. The dog had never asked for a plaque, had never asked for recognition, or a name people said out loud with reverence instead of pity, or a story that made the local news. He had simply done, on an ordinary Thursday night, the thing he had been trained to do years earlier by men who had trusted him with their lives on roads half a world away. He had smelled danger before it was strong enough for anyone else to notice, and he had told the one person nearby who still knew how to listen. Theo took to visiting the boiler room on the weekends his father brought him by the office, first tentatively, hovering in the doorway with the wary curiosity of a child who understood, on some instinctive level, that this room and this dog had saved his life and deserved to be approached with something like reverence. Marcus taught him slowly the right way to greet a working dog: hand low, palm open, no sudden movement, wait for the dog to close the distance rather than closing it yourself, and by the third visit Theo could recite the routine back word for word, solemn as a boy reciting a pledge. Ranger, for his part, developed a patience with the boy that surprised even Marcus, allowing him to sit close during the ointment changes, letting Theo hold the gauze while Marcus worked, the two of them forming an unlikely alliance across a gap of decades and different kinds of scars. Richard Reeves came down to the sub-basement himself more often than Marcus would ever have predicted 3 years earlier, usually trailing Theo, usually looking in that particular light less like the CEO of a company that owned a third of the district, and more like an ordinary father grateful in a way that never quite ran dry. He stopped bringing his assistant on those visits. He learned Marcus's name properly, and Priya's, and the names of 2 other members of the night crew he'd apparently never once addressed directly in 3 years of walking past them. It didn't fix everything about how a company like his operated, Marcus wasn't naive enough to think one bad Thursday night reordered an NT. Ray corporate culture, but it changed something at the scale that mattered most to him, in the only building he actually lived and worked inside of, and that was enough. Marcus scratched behind the ruined ear, careful of the old scar tissue, and Ranger let out a long, low breath content, home in the truest sense either of them had known in years. Somewhere above them, 41 stories of glass and steel held 200 offices full of people who would never know how close they'd come to losing something that night. And none of that mattered either, not down here, not in the quiet hum of machinery that had become, against every reasonable expectation, the closest thing to peace either of them had found since coming home from wherever it was they'd each been broken. "Good boy," Marcus said, the way he said it most nights now, quiet, unremarkable, entirely sufficient. Ranger's tail thumped once against the concrete floor, and outside the city went on, unaware, the way cities always do, of the small and enormous things happening in the rooms beneath their feet. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Marcus and Ranger's. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are so many more veterans and dogs out there whose stories deserve to be told with the care they earned. Drop a comment and let me know what part of this one stuck with you the most. I read every single one, and I love hearing which moments landed. And if you've got someone in your life who loves a good redemption story, a dog story, or just needs a reminder that loyalty still means something in this world, go ahead and share this video with them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.